They thought they were the hunters, but that day, the hunters became the hunted. On the frozen battlefields of Europe, a German tank crew spotted an American vehicle, small, thinly armored, and seemingly doomed. But before they could fire, it was gone. It vanished in seconds. What they witnessed defied everything they knew about warfare and marked the moment the M18 Hellcat earned its terrifying name. The thunder of tank warfare defined the battlefields of World War II. Across the smoldering plains of Europe, steel clashed with steel, and every nation sought the perfect balance between firepower, armor, and speed. The Germans believed they had achieved it with the Tiger I and Thuanogong, monsters of iron that dominated open fields and shattered enemy morale wherever they appeared. But by 1944, an unexpected challenger would emerge, a machine so fast that it defied every convention of armored combat. It was the M18 Hellcat, a name whispered by German tankers with disbelief. To understand why the Hellcat shocked them so deeply, one must return to the roots of the American armored doctrine. In 1941, as the U.S. prepared for a global war, its strategists faced a crucial question. Should a tank destroyer be a heavily armored beast or a nimble predator? The Army Ordnance Department and General Leslie McNair championed the latter. They envisioned specialized vehicles that could outmaneuver enemy tanks rather than duel them head-on. The concept was radical. Instead of adding thicker armor, U.S. engineers stripped it away, choosing speed as armor. The idea was simple yet dangerous. If the tank destroyer could move faster than the enemy could aim, it might survive longer and strike first. That philosophy gave birth to the M18 Hellcat, the fastest armored vehicle of World War II. Developed by Buick Motor Division in Michigan, the M18 was built with a lightweight chassis, a powerful Continental R975C1 radial engine, and an open-topped turret that allowed crews a wide field of view. It could reach an incredible 55 miles per hour, 89 km/h, a speed unheard of for tanks at the time. Soldiers joked that it could outrun its own shells, but on the battlefield, that velocity became a deadly advantage. The first prototypes appeared in 1943 under the codename T-70, and they immediately impressed Army evaluators. Yet some commanders were skeptical. How could a vehicle with armor barely thick enough to stop rifle fire possibly survive against a Tiger or Panther? The engineer's answer was blunt. It doesn't need to. It just won't be there when the enemy shoots. By mid-1944, as Allied troops stormed through Normandy after D-Day, the M18 began arriving in Europe. Assigned to specialized tank destroyer battalions, these sleek machines looked almost fragile beside the massive Shermans and Pershings. Their crews, mostly young men in their early 20s, nicknamed their mounts Hellcats for the way they sprinted across the French countryside. The setting was a continent aflame. France, 1944, villages reduced to rubble, wheat fields turned to ash, and armored columns crawling through narrow hedgerows. The German Panzer divisions, though battered, still fought with precision and ferocity. In those claustrophobic lanes, the difference between survival and destruction came down to seconds. And seconds were what the Hellcat owned. Its crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, learned to use their machine's speed like a magician's trick. They would dash into position, fire, and vanish before German optics could track them. "We never stayed still for more than 20 seconds," one veteran recalled. "That's how long it took for a Panther to turn its turret." The main armament, the 76 Seeburg mit M1A1 gun, was not the most powerful of the war, but when combined with tungsten ammunition and the Hellcat's mobility, it became lethal. Against the side or rear armor of German tanks, it could penetrate cleanly. The doctrine was, don't get hit, hit first, and vanish. At the strategic level, this philosophy represented America's broader industrial mindset. Where Germany built fewer, heavier tanks, the U.S. built many lighter ones. Fast, reliable, and easy to maintain. The M18 embodied that approach perfectly. It could be repaired in hours, not days, and its crews loved its responsive handling. "She drove like a sports car," one driver said, "until you realized people were trying to kill you." In the summer of 1944, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion received its new Hellcats and moved toward the front lines near Normandy. The German retreat after Operation Cobra left many scattered armored formations trying to regroup. This was the Hellcats' baptism by fire, a chance to prove that speed could truly slay steel. Their first engagements were cautious. The crews learned quickly that their open turret exposed them to snipers and shrapnel. They operated best in ambushes, lying hidden behind hedgerows or ruins until a Panzer appeared, then striking from unexpected angles. German crews used to fighting lumbering Shermans found themselves facing opponents that moved like ghosts. By September, as the Allies pushed toward Belgium, word of the new American racing tank spread through German radio channels. Reports described a small, turreted vehicle that seemed impossible to hit. Some German Panzer commanders dismissed it as propaganda. Others began to worry. If the Americans had found a way to combine mobility and firepower, their armored advantage might be slipping away. One battlefield report from the German 2nd Panzer Division recorded, "Enemy light tank destroyers struck our column near Mons. They were fast, unbelievably fast. By the time our guns turned, they had disappeared behind the hill. Losses: 4 vehicles." That note, dry and military, could not capture the shock German crews felt as the Hellcats darted through the smoke like phantoms. Meanwhile, American commanders refined their tactics. The M18s would not operate alone, but in coordinated packs. One vehicle would draw enemy fire, forcing the German turret to swing, while another flanked for a clean shot. It was deadly choreography, and the Hellcat was the perfect dancer. In the small French town of St. Gilles, a Hellcat platoon encountered its first Tiger I. The Tiger's 88-mm gun could obliterate a Hellcat with a single hit, but its turret turned slowly, like a tower rotating on rusted gears. The Hellcat commander ordered full speed, darting through an alleyway at over 40 mm, circling behind the Tiger before firing into its engine deck. One shot. The Tiger erupted. The Germans never saw what hit them. Stories like these spread quickly. Within weeks, the Hellcat's reputation was sealed, not as the most heavily armed, but as the most untouchable. The Germans had faced many enemies who stood and fought. They had never faced one who vanished. The importance of this new arrival went far beyond battlefield anecdotes. Strategically, it marked a shift in how the Allies thought about armored warfare. It wasn't brute strength that won battles anymore. It was agility, coordination, and initiative. The Hellcat was not a brawler. It was a boxer with lightning footwork. Yet its crews paid a price for that speed. The Hellcat's armor was paper-thin, just 12.7 mm at its thickest. A burst of machine gun fire could wound the crew, and artillery shrapnel was deadly. "Driving a Hellcat was like racing in a convertible during a thunderstorm," said one sergeant. "Exciting until the first bolt hit you." Despite the risks, their morale was high. They took pride in being the fastest guns on tracks. The Hellcat gave them something few soldiers experienced in World War II, a sense of control. They could choose when and where to fight, and often dictate the battle's tempo. By October 1944, the Hellcat had become a nightmare for German armored patrols. Near the town of Nancy, a unit of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion executed a textbook ambush against a Panther column. Moving at high speed through fog and mud, the Hellcats positioned themselves on a ridge, waiting until the Panzers appeared. 3 minutes later, it was over. 5 German tanks destroyed, not one Hellcat lost. Witnesses said the speed was so great that German crews could barely track them. "Sie waren wie Geister. They were like ghosts," one German gunner later recalled. "They fired, and before the smoke cleared, they were gone." It was the first time many Wehrmacht tankers realized their armor could be outmaneuvered so completely. The Hellcat was not just a vehicle. It was a symbol of a changing war. It embodied the American belief in innovation and adaptability, that you didn't need to match the enemy's strength if you could outthink and outrun him. This philosophy would soon culminate in one of the most astonishing tank battles of the European theater. That battle would take place in September 1944 near the village of Arracourt, France. It would pit American tank destroyers against the elite German 5th Panzer Army. It was here that the Hellcat's legend would be forged, where German tank crews would literally watch in shock as the M18 disappeared in seconds, only to strike from an angle they never expected. But that moment of revelation did not come overnight. Before the clash at Arracourt, Hellcat units spent weeks learning the terrain, mapping villages and perfecting maneuvers. They knew that their survival depended not on armor, but on precision and timing. Every crew drill was a race against death. 26. The average Hellcat crew could spot a target, aim, fire, and move in under 25 seconds. German tank crews, encumbered by their heavy machines, often took twice as long. That difference was everything. In war, a few seconds could mean the difference between life and obliteration. To many observers, the Hellcat represented a paradox of American engineering. It was both fragile and fearsome. Its open turret was a liability in rain and artillery, yet it gave an unmatched view of the battlefield. Its thin armor was a risk, but its speed made that risk worth taking. At night, Hellcat crews slept beside their machines, the metal still warm from combat. They painted names on their hulls: Lightning Lucy, Hell's Angel, Ghost Rider. They knew that each day could be their last, but they also knew they were part of something extraordinary, a new chapter in armored warfare. As the Allied advance pressed east, the German High Command grew desperate. They needed a counter to the fast-moving Hellcats and Shermans that were now cutting through their supply lines. Orders went out to launch a massive counterattack in Lorraine, France, a plan that would lead directly to the showdown at Arracourt. By mid-September 1944, the stage was set. The weather was cold and foggy. German Panther and Tiger tanks rolled forward through the mist, believing they would crush the thinly armored American forces ahead. They did not know that waiting for them, hidden in the shadows, were Hellcats revving their engines, ready to vanish and strike in seconds. September 1944. The fields of Lorraine lay draped in a heavy fog that muffled the roar of engines and turned every hedgerow into a shadow. It was in this uncertain landscape that the M18 Hellcats of the 704th and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions prepared to meet the might of the German Panzer divisions. The men could hear the distant rumble of enemy armor moving through the mist, a sound that sent a shiver through even the most seasoned crews. Somewhere out there, dozens of Panthers and Tigers were advancing, confident that their thick armor made them invincible. But the American tank destroyer crews had something the Germans didn't: speed, flexibility, and initiative. Their commanders, especially Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton, understood that the terrain favored the quick. The fog that hid the German tanks would also hide the Hellcats, turning the battlefield into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Except this time, the cats were faster. Early that morning, the Hellcats were spread out across ridgelines and small villages east of Arracourt, a quiet French settlement that would soon become synonymous with destruction. Visibility was limited to less than 100 meters. The crews strained to hear movement, the grind of tracks, the clank of metal. Then, out of the fog, dark shapes began to materialize. Panthers moving in column formation, their guns scanning left and right. A Hellcat gunner whispered into his radio, "Target spotted, range 50 yards, wait for my mark." The entire crew froze, hearts pounding. The Panther's turret turned, too slowly. "Fire!" The 76mm gun cracked, a flash of light splitting the fog. The round slammed into the Panther's flank, bursting through its thin side armor. Flames erupted from the engine deck. Before the smoke cleared, the Hellcat's driver threw the vehicle into reverse, vanishing behind a farmhouse. By the time German gunners returned fire, their target had already disappeared. This was the rhythm of Arracourt. Swift ambushes, rapid withdrawals, constant relocation. The Hellcat's incredible acceleration allowed it to engage and disengage before the enemy could even find its range. For the German tankers used to slow duels of attrition, this was chaos. Their heavy tanks, designed for long-range engagements, were now trapped in short, unpredictable skirmishes against invisible foes. 36. At one crossroad near the village of Arracourt, 3 Hellcats faced 7 German Panthers. Outnumbered and outgunned, the American crews split up. One Hellcat sped across open ground at full throttle, drawing the Panthers' attention. As the German turrets laboriously followed, the other 2 Hellcats circled behind, using the fog for cover. Within minutes, they fired at near point-blank range, igniting 2 Panthers before the rest even realized they were flanked. The Hellcat that had acted as bait darted away untouched. It had been moving too fast for the German gunners to hit. Afterward, a captured German tanker described the encounter. "We saw them only for a moment. Small, fast, impossible to hit. They moved like wasps, stinging and disappearing. Our shells passed through the fog, hitting nothing." That account spread through the ranks of the 5th Panzer Army, and panic began to seep in. The myth of German armored invincibility was cracking. For the American crews, the battles were exhausting. They fought without rest for days, often in rain and mud, sleeping inside their open turrets under thin blankets. The smell of burnt fuel and cordite clung to everything. But morale remained high, because for the first time they were not the ones running. They were the hunters. Each engagement brought new lessons. The Hellcat crews learned to use terrain like a weapon. Slopes for cover, roads for quick strikes, and villages for ambush points. Communication was key. Over the radios, short, clipped messages cut through the static. 3 Panthers, left ridge, moving slow. Copy that. Hellcat 2, repositioning. Fire on my mark. It was coordination at its finest. And it worked. During one remarkable encounter near Lizy, an American Hellcat platoon ambushed an entire German column. The lead Panther exploded before the rest realized they were under attack. In the confusion, the remaining tanks fired blindly into the fog, striking their own vehicles. When the smoke cleared, 6 German tanks burned in the valley, while the Hellcats slipped away untouched. The Germans couldn't believe it. They thought they had been attacked by aircraft, not tanks. As reports poured in, German field commanders struggled to adjust. The Panther was designed for stand-up fights, not for chasing ghosts. Its heavy armor and slow turret rotation became liabilities. "We are blind and slow," one officer lamented in his diary. "They move like rabbits, but bite like wolves." The psychological toll on German crews was immense. Every hedgerow became a potential trap. Every moment of silence could mean death waiting around the corner. Tank commanders began to fire prematurely or retreat at the first sign of movement. The once fearsome panzer divisions were now playing defense. Meanwhile, Allied command began to realize just how effective the Hellcat doctrine was. Reports from Arracourt showed a kill ratio of 5-1 in favor of the M18s. For every Hellcat destroyed, several German tanks were knocked out. And these victories came not from brute strength but from speed, coordination, and nerve. Lieutenant Templeton's strategy became textbook. Let the Germans come, force them to reveal their position, then strike from the flanks. His men called it the dance, and in that dance the Hellcat was unrivaled. "You couldn't stand still," one driver later said. "You had to keep moving or you'd die. But when you moved right, it was beautiful." In one battle near Bazoches-la-Petite, a single Hellcat held off an entire platoon of German tanks for nearly half an hour. Constantly shifting position, firing and relocating, the crew confused the Germans into thinking they faced multiple vehicles. When reinforcements arrived, they found 5 burning tanks and 1 exhausted Hellcat crew, their faces blackened with soot and disbelief at their own survival. Despite such successes, the Hellcat crews never forgot how fragile their machines were. One hit could end everything. They avoided direct duels and preferred ambushes. Their open turrets exposed them to artillery fragments and snipers. "You didn't sit still long enough to think about fear," recalled Gunner James Corbett of the 704th. "You just did your job. Fast." The battlefield at Arracourt was transforming into a graveyard of German armor. The fog that once shielded the attackers now betrayed them. American spotters, guiding artillery and air support, directed fire with ruthless precision. The Hellcats moved like cavalry, sweeping in to finish off immobilized Panthers. It was tank warfare unlike anything the world had seen before, a symphony of motion and timing. Even General Patton, whose Third Army oversaw the region, took notice. When he visited the front lines after the battle, he reportedly said, "Those Hellcats moved like lightning. That's how you fight a war. Hit fast, hit hard, and never stop." Coming from a man obsessed with momentum, it was high praise. But behind every victory lay sacrifice. Many Hellcat crews didn't make it back. A single misjudgment, a second too long in the open, could be fatal. The open-top design that gave visibility also meant that shrapnel rained freely into the turret during bombardments. Drivers and loaders were often killed instantly. Survivors buried friends beside smoking wrecks before climbing back in to continue the fight. As the Germans began to retreat from Lorraine, they left behind more than 200 destroyed or abandoned vehicles. The Americans had lost fewer than 30 Hellcats. Statistically, it was one of the most lopsided armored engagements of the war. But for those who fought it, numbers meant little. What mattered was the realization that speed and intelligence had beaten steel and fear. For the German tank crews, disbelief turned to dread. Reports described enemy vehicles that seemed to disappear in seconds after firing. The myth of Allied inferiority was dead. The once invincible Tigers and Panthers were now being hunted by machines that looked too light to matter, yet struck like thunderbolts. As autumn set in, the survivors of the Panzer divisions limped back toward the Siegfried Line. The fog lifted, revealing a landscape littered with the burnt-out carcasses of German armor. The Hellcat crews watched in silence. They had won, but they knew the war was far from over. Ahead lay the forests of the Ardennes, and whispers of a coming counteroffensive that would test them again. Still, something fundamental had changed in the minds of both sides. The Germans had learned that their heavy tanks were not invincible, and the Americans had discovered that mobility was the ultimate weapon. The Hellcat was proof that in modern war, agility and intelligence could triumph over brute force. That revelation echoed through every tank destroyer battalion in Europe. Crews began training new recruits using lessons from Arracourt. Keep moving, never engage frontally, trust your driver, and always strike from the shadows. Manuals were updated, tactics were rewritten. The M18 Hellcat had changed how the U.S. Army fought. As winter approached, the men of the 704th and 705th cleaned their vehicles and repaired what they could. They painted fresh names on the hulls: Lucky Lady, Fast Freddy, Thunderbolt. They didn't know it yet, but soon they would face their greatest challenge during the Battle of the Bulge, where snow and chaos would once again test the Hellcat's legend. But for now, in the calm after the storm of Arracourt, they allowed themselves a moment of pride. They had done the impossible, outsmarted and outrun the best armored forces in the world. And somewhere in Germany, Panzer commanders sat in their bunkers, replaying the same question in disbelief. How could a tank that light simply disappear? The morning fog over Lorraine was so thick that even the birds seemed lost in it. Visibility dropped to barely 20 meters and every sound was distorted. The creak of tracks, the rumble of engines, the faint metallic echo of turrets turning. In that silence, fear had a weight. For the German 5th Panzer Army, It was supposed to be a counteroffensive that would reclaim honor. For the Hellcat crews waiting in the mist, it was survival by seconds. 58. At 06:30 a.m., the German assault began. Columns of Panthers and Mark IVs advanced through the haze toward the small village of Bézange-le-Petit. Their commanders were confident. The Americans could not possibly stand against such armored might. But what they didn't know was that a platoon of M18 Hellcats lay hidden behind an embankment overlooking the valley. Engines idled low, radios crackling softly. Every man listened, waiting for the signal. The first Panther emerged from the fog like a phantom. Its long barrel swept left, then right, searching. The Hellcat commander whispered, "Hold, hold." The gunner's finger trembled on the trigger. The Panther paused, turning its turret. "Fire!" The 76mm gun thundered, and the armor-piercing round punched through the Panther's flank like paper. Flames burst from its turret ring. Before the echo faded, the Hellcat reversed down the slope, vanishing from sight. To the Germans, it was as if the ground itself had spat fire. Seconds later, two more Hellcats shifted position. Their drivers slammed into gear, racing through a narrow farm road at nearly 50 km/h. They appeared briefly through the fog, fired, and disappeared again, leaving German tankers spinning their turrets toward ghosts. Shells exploded where the Hellcats had been 10 seconds earlier, hitting nothing but churned earth. From a nearby observation point, Lieutenant Templeton watched through binoculars. The fog, he realized, was both curse and blessing. It made coordination nearly impossible, yet it amplified the illusion that a dozen Hellcats prowled where only a few actually were. He keyed his radio. "All units, maintain motion, never stay still, make them shoot at smoke." The German tank commander, Captain Ernst Haller, was furious. He had lost 3 tanks within minutes and hadn't even seen the enemy clearly. "Keep advancing," he barked, but every 100 meters another flash erupted from the fog. Another tank burst into flames. To his men, it felt less like battle and more like being hunted by invisible predators. One German gunner later recalled, "We fired into the mist. Nothing. Then out of nowhere a shell hit us from behind. Before we could traverse, they were gone again. It was madness." The legend of the vanishing Hellcats was born that day. At the center of the storm, Sergeant James Corbett and his crew were running their Hellcat Lucky Lady at full speed between hedgerows. The driver, Private Leon Soto, kept his foot pressed to the floor. Mud flew from the tracks as they darted from one firing point to another. Their open turret let the cold fog sting their faces, but it also gave them full awareness. "Target, Tiger Eye at 12 o'clock, Corbett shouted. The gunner swung the 76mm into line, fired, then immediately yelled, "Reverse!" The shell struck the Tiger's side armor, igniting its ammunition. The explosion shook the ground. German infantry scattered as burning tanks lit up the valley. The fog glowed orange, and in that infernal light the Hellcats moved like shadows of fire. Brief, bright, gone. The radios crackled with overlapping voices. "Panthers retreating west. Hellcat 3 out of ammo. Move to secondary position." Every message carried the heartbeat of a war fought at lightning speed. By mid-morning, Templeton ordered a feigned withdrawal to lure the Germans forward. The plan worked. As the Panthers pressed on, thinking the Americans were in retreat, they drove straight into a kill zone where hidden Hellcats waited along the ridgeline. Within minutes, 6 German tanks were destroyed. The rest halted in confusion, their formation shattered. From the air, Allied P-47s dove through breaks in the fog, finishing the job with rockets. In the aftermath, a German officer surveyed the field and muttered in disbelief, "Es waren nur wenige Panzer." There were only a few tanks. The sheer efficiency of the ambush defied logic. How could such lightly armored vehicles devastate an entire battalion of panzers? The answer was clear to anyone who had seen it. Speed. The Hellcat's top speed of 55 mph was more than twice that of a Panther or Tiger. On flat terrain, it could reposition before the enemy even realized where it had fired from. This agility allowed American crews to fight on their own terms. They could pick the moment, the angle, and the range, and once they fired, they were already gone. One of the most famous episodes occurred near the village of Moncourt. A platoon of M18s encountered 10 German Panthers advancing through open farmland. Realizing the danger, Lieutenant Henry Zimmer ordered his Hellcats to divide. 2 would draw fire head-on. The others would loop around a grove and strike from the side. The decoys raced directly at the Panthers, zigzagging to avoid shells. The Germans, startled by their speed, fired wildly. At that instant, Zimmer's flanking Hellcats opened fire from 400 yards, hitting 4 Panthers in rapid succession. Before the remaining 6 could react, the decoys had vanished behind a ridge. When the battle ended, all 10 German tanks were burning. Not a single Hellcat was lost. Zimmer later told a war correspondent, "It wasn't bravery, it was math. They were too slow, we were too quick, that's all." But to the Germans, it felt supernatural. Back in Berlin, reports from Lorraine reached high command. They were met with disbelief. "How can light tank destroyers defeat our elite units?" an officer asked. The explanation was tactical, but the humiliation was psychological. The once unstoppable Panzers were being undone not by heavier weapons, but by ideas. For the men on the ground, the horror was personal. German crews who survived spoke of shells coming out of thin air, of American vehicles that seemed to teleport. In truth, it was the perfect storm: fog, mobility, and daring. The Hellcats didn't just fight battles, they rewrote them in real time. As the fog lifted that afternoon, the battlefield revealed its terrible beauty. Dozens of wrecked tanks lay smoking across the valley, their armor twisted and blackened. The air smelled of fuel and ash. American engineers moved in to recover the Hellcats, many with scorched paint but still operational. Mechanics marveled at how these machines, built in car factories back home, had survived such hell. Journalists visiting days later described the scene as a graveyard of steel. One Time magazine correspondent wrote, "The American Hellcat, though light as a racing car, has proven that agility can conquer arrogance. German armor learned humility in the fields of Lorraine." The words would become famous among tank destroyer crews, a badge of honor etched into their memory. In the middle of it all, Sergeant Corbett and his crew sat atop their Hellcat, eating from tin rations, the metal hulls still warm. They were too tired to celebrate. "Feels like we just outran death again," Soto muttered. Corbett nodded. He looked at the burnt outline of a Tiger II in the distance. "Maybe speed really is armor," he said softly. Across the lines, Captain Holler stood beside what remained of his company. 2 tanks out of 15. He removed his headset and stared at the wrecks. "They weren't tanks," he told his adjutant. "They were demons on tracks." That phrase, Dämonen auf Ketten, spread among German troops like wildfire. As dusk fell, Templeton reported to Corps headquarters. "Enemy attack repulsed, heavy losses inflicted, our casualties minimal." But his tone was somber. He knew the next battles would not always offer such favorable conditions. The Germans would adapt, and winter was coming. Yet for that day, victory belonged to the Hellcats. The Battle of Arracourt had ended with over 80 German tanks destroyed, many by the M18s alone. Historians would later call it one of the most decisive tank engagements of the European War. The lesson was clear. Agility and teamwork could outmatch brute strength. For the German crews who escaped, the experience left scars. They began to question every shadow, every movement on the horizon. The idea that the enemy could appear, strike, and vanish before they even aimed shattered morale. For the first time, Panzer commanders issued new directives: avoid close-range engagements with fast American tank destroyers at all costs. And so, the M18 Hellcat's reputation reached legendary status. To Allied soldiers, it was the perfect predator. To the Germans, it was a ghost that mocked their armor. Its speed turned physics into fear, and its name into a warning. In those few terrifying seconds when it vanished from sight, it left behind not just wreckage, but disbelief. The men who drove them never forgot that feeling. The vibration of the engine beneath their feet, the rush of air as they sped through smoke, the explosion behind them signaling another victory snatched from the jaws of death. They had witnessed what no textbook of war had ever predicted, that sometimes the lightest machine could cast the darkest shadow. When the smoke of Arracourt finally cleared, the battlefield looked like a scrapyard of history. The once green French countryside was now a wasteland of blackened steel and twisted tracks. Dozens of German tanks lay overturned or gutted, their once formidable armor scorched and useless. The faint smell of oil and cordite hung in the damp air. In that silence, the M18 Hellcat had written a new chapter in the story of war, a chapter that stunned generals as much as it inspired engineers. Military analysts on both sides rushed to make sense of what had happened. The Germans had lost more than 80 tanks in a week, the Americans fewer than 30. Those numbers were impossible under traditional doctrine. The Panzer divisions had always relied on heavier guns and thicker armor, but the Hellcat had flipped the equation. Speed, coordination, and initiative had defeated armor, firepower, and prestige. The official U.S. Army report described the Hellcat as the most successful tank destroyer engagement of the European campaign. In dry military tone, it credited the outcome to mobility, discipline, and communication. But among the soldiers who fought there, the explanation was simpler. They trusted their speed. "We didn't fight the way they expected," one Hellcat commander said. "We fought like lightning. You can't hit lightning." At Allied headquarters, General Patton reviewed the battle maps in admiration. "Those Hellcats made fools of the Panzers," he remarked to his staff. "That's what happens when brains beat brawn." To Patton, the victory validated his core belief that momentum, not mass, wins wars. He immediately requested more M18s for his Third Army. 86. In Berlin, the reaction was disbelief bordering on denial. Intelligence officers refused to accept that such a light vehicle could wreak so much havoc. "It must have been air power," one insisted. Others blamed fog, bad luck, or inferior fuel quality. But for the men who had faced the Hellcat firsthand, there was no illusion. Their own reports told the story. The enemy appeared, fired, and was gone before they could respond. One field report from the 11th Panzer Division read, "American light tanks possess extraordinary mobility. Their speed renders counterfire nearly impossible. Heavy armor is insufficient defense." In the margins, a frustrated officer had scribbled a single word: unfair. Inside U.S. Army Ordnance, engineers studied battlefield feedback with fascination. They had gambled on the idea that speed is armor, and now the results were undeniable. The M18 Hellcat had proven that maneuver could be a form of protection. The lesson would echo for decades in future tank design, from the agile Cold War vehicles to the modern doctrines of strike-and-evade warfare. 89. The battle also forced the Army to reconsider how it used its tank destroyer battalions. Originally designed for defense, they had now shown their offensive potential. Instead of merely reacting to enemy armor, the Hellcats were used to spearhead assaults, exploiting breakthroughs with blistering speed. The doctrine of seek, strike, destroy, and withdraw became standard training. For the men on the ground, the aftermath was both triumph and trauma. The exhilaration of victory gave way to exhaustion. Many crews had fought for days without rest, living on cold rations and adrenaline. When the fighting stopped, silence felt unnatural. Some sat beside their vehicles, staring at the wrecked Panthers as if still expecting them to move. Others wrote letters home, trying to explain what it felt like to outrun death. Sergeant James Corbett wrote to his mother, We faced tanks twice our size and lived to tell it. The trick is not to be brave, just fast. We move, shoot, and pray. The Hellcat is our angel of speed." That letter, later published in a hometown newspaper, captured the spirit of an entire generation of tank destroyer crews. Meanwhile, Allied photographers documented the devastation for intelligence archives. Their black and white images, Hellcats idling beside burning Tigers, would later appear in magazines back home, inspiring a mix of pride and disbelief among civilians. Readers couldn't comprehend how a vehicle that looked so small could defeat the feared beasts of Europe. German morale, by contrast, took a severe blow. Survivors from Arracourt described the M18 Hellcat with a mix of awe and resentment. "They were too fast, too clever," said one captured Panzer gunner. "It felt like fighting ghosts." Rumors spread that the Americans had new secret engines or even experimental armor. None of it was true. The secret was simply daring and teamwork. The psychological effect lingered. German tank commanders began avoiding open ground unless artillery or Luftwaffe cover was guaranteed. Patrols grew slower, more hesitant. Even when Hellcats weren't present, the fear of them changed German behavior. A victory of the mind as much as of metal. In the months following Arracourt, the U.S. Army began shipping more M18s to Europe. Crews proudly painted white cat emblems and lightning bolts on their turrets. The vehicle became a morale symbol, proof that American engineering could not only match but outthink the enemy. Soldiers called it the cat that killed the tiger. The Hellcat's reputation even reached the Pacific Theater. Reports of its speed and success influenced planners preparing for the expected invasion of Japan. Though it would never see combat there, the war ended before that day. Its legend preceded it. Generals studying armored warfare began emphasizing mobility and initiative over static defense. 97. In post-war analyses, military historians noted that the M18's open-topped design, once criticized as dangerous, had actually contributed to its success. The 360-degree visibility allowed faster target acquisition and communication. It turned crews into instinctive, responsive units. A human-machine synergy that foreshadowed modern tank teamwork. However, the aftermath was not without controversy. Critics argued that the Tank Destroyer Command's obsession with mobility left crews vulnerable. Many pointed to high casualty rates among open-top vehicles when faced with artillery or aircraft. The Army eventually dissolved the separate tank destroyer branch in 1946, but its lessons lived on in the armored cavalry and reconnaissance units that followed. For Germany, the defeat at Arracourt signaled more than a tactical loss. It shattered the myth of the invincible Panzer. The Reich had built its propaganda on armored superiority. That image burned with the wrecks in Lorraine. The Hellcat had proven that innovation and adaptability could overcome even the most formidable war machines. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the reports from Lorraine were buried under piles of more desperate dispatches from the collapsing front. But among Wehrmacht officers, the fear was palpable. They realized that if the Americans could field hundreds of fast, efficient tank destroyers while producing thousands of Shermans, Germany's industrial war was already lost. For the American soldiers, however, victory carried a different weight. The men of the 704th and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions received commendations, but no parades. Their battles were fought in fog, not in headlines. "We didn't look heroic," one veteran said years later. "We looked dirty, tired, and scared, but we got the job done." As winter approached, those same men prepared for another storm, the Battle of the Bulge. There, the Hellcat would again prove its worth, racing across snow-covered roads to counter surprise attacks. Even in sub-zero temperatures, its engines roared to life like restless predators. The Arracourt engagement became a case study in military academies worldwide. Soviet analysts later studied the Hellcat's tactics when developing their own fast attack doctrines. Decades later, U.S. Army manuals still quoted the lessons of 1944. Speed creates confusion. Confusion creates victory. War correspondent Andy Rooney, who visited the Hellcat units in late 1944, wrote in his journal, "They laughed at their own danger. They raced their tanks as if it were a sport. But there's something deeper. They believe they can win by thinking faster. Maybe that's the real American secret." In engineering terms, the Hellcat's light frame and airplane-derived engine set a precedent for post-war armored vehicles. Future designs like the M24 Chaffee and M41 Walker Bulldog inherited its mobility genes. Even modern reconnaissance vehicles trace their lineage to the M18's design philosophy: speed over steel. But among the veterans, memories mattered more than mechanics. They remembered the freezing fog, the smell of burnt oil, the thunder of their own engines, and the haunting sight of German tanks burning at dawn. "We weren't superheroes," one driver said. "We were just lucky and fast." After the war, many Hellcats were sold to Allied nations or scrapped, but a few found new life in museums and parades. When surviving crew members reunited years later, they stood beside those preserved machines like old comrades. Some touched the steel hulls and whispered thanks, not to the war, but to the speed that saved them. Military historians continued debating: was the Hellcat truly superior, or simply lucky to fight under perfect conditions? The consensus eventually settled on both. The fog, the terrain, and the enemy's overconfidence all contributed, but none of it would have mattered without the Hellcat's unique blend of agility and daring crews. The greatest impact of Arracourt wasn't measured in destroyed tanks, but in ideas. It proved that warfare had entered a new era, one where information, coordination, and speed outweighed mass and armor. The lessons of the M18 would later echo in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. And yet, for the men who had lived through it, the aftermath of Arracourt was not about doctrine or data. It was about the sound, the unique roar of that radial engine at full throttle, the heartbeat of survival. It was about disappearing just before the enemy's shell hit the spot you'd been standing, and realizing you'd cheated death again. By the spring of 1945, the thunder of German armor had faded into distant echoes. The once invincible Panzers that terrified Europe now lay scattered across muddy fields and bomb-cratered roads. Amid the wreckage, the sleek silhouette of the M18 Hellcat stood as a paradox. A machine that looked too light to survive yet had rewritten the rules of tank warfare. Its legacy would outlast the smoke and rubble it left behind. For the men who drove it, the war ended not with fanfare, but with exhaustion. When victory was declared, Hellcat crews parked their beloved machines along hedgerows and simply sat in silence. Some wept. Others stared at the horizon, remembering friends who never made it home. The Hellcat had given them survival, but survival came with ghosts. As peace settled over Europe, Allied commanders began documenting what the Hellcat's campaigns had taught them. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a philosophy. Mobility is protection. The doctrine that armor must equal safety had been shattered. From that point forward, every modern army would have to balance speed, firepower, and flexibility in ways never imagined before 1944. In post-war trials, military engineers compared the Hellcat's combat data to that of heavier vehicles. The results were startling. In equal numbers, Hellcats outperformed heavier tanks when terrain and coordination were factors. The reason was simple. They struck first, they struck fast, and they refused to fight fair. It was proof that the future of warfare belonged to those who could adapt faster than they could reload. Across the Atlantic, in factories that once produced Buicks and Cadillacs, the war effort had transformed American industry into a powerhouse of innovation. The M18 was a child of that revolution, a sports car turned killer. Its engineers had built not just a machine, but an idea: that technology serves courage best when it listens to the battlefield, not the drawing board. The Hellcat's DNA lived on. Post-war designs like the M24 Chaffee and M41 Walker Bulldog borrowed its agility. Decades later, when Cold War strategists drafted doctrines for NATO's Rapid Response Forces, they looked back to Lorraine 1944. Even the U.S. Abrams and Germany's Leopard 2 carry that legacy. Massive engines, reactive mobility, and the same belief that speed can be armor if used with intelligence. Yet, beyond steel and strategy, the Hellcat's story is human. Young soldiers barely out of high school became masters of a machine that demanded nerve over armor. They raced through fog, fired at shadows, and vanished before the enemy could breathe. Many would say later that it wasn't bravery that saved them. It was trust in their crew, in their commander, and in the hum of that roaring radial engine. Veteran John B. Wright once said during an interview in 1967, "We weren't heroes. We were mechanics with a death wish, but the Hellcat gave us wings on tracks." His laughter faded into a pause. You never forget the sound of speed saving your life. That quote would be engraved decades later on a memorial plaque dedicated to tank destroyer battalions in Fort Hood, Texas. In Germany, some former Panzer officers admitted grudging admiration. They studied the Hellcat's maneuvers after the war, acknowledging that it embodied a principle they had ignored, that flexibility was stronger than arrogance. "We built fortresses," one recalled. "They built hunters." It was a hard-earned respect born from fire. The battlefield of Arracourt was reclaimed by farmers after the war. Crops grew where tanks once burned, and children played over what remained of trenches. Yet every so often, a rusted shell casing or twisted track link surfaced from the soil, reminders of the speed and terror that once swept across those fields. The land remembered what the world nearly forgot. 121. In museums today, restored Hellcats gleam under bright lights, their engines silent but their stories alive. Visitors climb the narrow hulls, imagining what it must have felt like to race across Europe at 55 miles per hour while shells screamed overhead. The veterans who guide them speak softly, their words heavy with memory. "This wasn't just a tank," one said. "It was freedom on tracks." Modern historians still debate whether the M18 Hellcat was the perfect tank destroyer. Some argue that its light armor doomed too many crews. Others insist its speed saved more lives than any plate of steel ever could. But all agree on one truth. It redefined how men and machines could fight, with precision, agility, and sheer nerve. The Hellcat was more than a product of war. It was a metaphor for America itself in 1944. Young, fast, untested, and reckless enough to challenge the giants. It showed the world that ingenuity could outmatch intimidation, and that courage often rides on the back of innovation. In every sense, it was the American spirit made mechanical. Even now, military tacticians and gamers alike study its movements, its silhouette, its doctrine. In simulations and documentaries, the M18 still races across screens, still vanishes into fog, still surprises its enemies. The same gasp that left German crews speechless in 1944 echoes through history lessons today. The moment disbelief turns to awe. And perhaps that is the true power of the Hellcat. Not just in how it fought, but in how it made the enemy feel. Terror isn't always born from destruction. Sometimes it comes from the realization that what you thought impossible has just happened before your eyes. The Germans watched in shock as the M18 disappeared in seconds, and with it, the illusion of invincibility. When historians write of tanks, they often speak of armor thickness, gun caliber, and production numbers. But the Hellcat's numbers tell another story. 5 men per vehicle, barely an inch of armor, and yet one of the highest kill ratios of the war. Its greatest weapon was time, those precious seconds between being seen and being gone. For audiences watching today, its legacy carries a timeless message. Innovation is born from risk. The Hellcat's creators dared to build something different when everyone else built heavier. Its crews dared to trust speed over safety. And in doing so, they taught the world that bravery sometimes looks like running, but running forward. If you stand beside a surviving M18 today and place your hand on its armor, you can almost feel that heartbeat of velocity, the hum of an idea that refused to be conventional. It whispers through the metal. Move first, think faster, never stop. That whisper is the sound of evolution, in war, in technology, in the human spirit. As the sun sets over restored museums and quiet battlefields, the legend of the Hellcat endures not because it destroyed tanks, but because it changed minds. It proved that progress favors the bold, that even the smallest engine can shift the course of history, and that sometimes the best defense is speed itself. So the next time you see those black and white wartime reels, smoke, fog, and streaks of motion across a ruined village, remember the crews who rode into that chaos. Remember the moment German tankers blinked in disbelief as a light armored blur vanished into the mist, only to strike again from nowhere. Remember the Hellcat. If you've enjoyed this story of courage, innovation, and sheer battlefield brilliance, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more forgotten tales of World War II, where history's greatest machines, battles, and heroes come roaring back to life. Leave a comment below. Would you ride in a Hellcat knowing your only armor was speed? And as always, keep your eyes on the horizon, because history moves fast.